Okay, talking about the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl today. There will be 10 homework questions, this handout, and I think two or three short videos talking about the life in the 1930s and the Dust Bowl. Okay? All right, here we go. So, we've talked about this a little bit off and on without really getting into details about it. So, what was the Dust Bowl? Okay? Dust Bowl was an area in the Midwest that suffered from the drought during the 1930s and during the Great Depression. The soil became so dry that it turned to dust. Farmers could no longer grow crops as the land basically was turning into a desert. Okay? Areas of Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico was all part of the Dust Bowl. Okay, so that was a big portion of the nation right there, okay? Especially in the Midwest. That covered a huge, huge area. A number of factors contributed to the Dust Bowl. The first was a terrible drought that lasted for many years. With so little rain, the soil dried out, okay? Also, much of the region had been plowed up by farmers for a number of years to grow wheat or to graze cattle or something of that nature. So the prairie grass that was there was gone. And when we get into marine biology, we'll talk about the grasses actually helps to keep the soil in place. Okay? So with those grasses either being plowed under or cattle eating all of it, there's nothing to help hold the soil into place, okay? And of course, during World War I, wheat was in big demand to help feed the troops overseas and stuff, so farmers were growing wheat year after year after year instead of rotating their crops and giving the land a time to recoup. That wasn't happening, okay? Yes, Parker?
They'll probably be like horrible if you're like 13 years old, like you're not going to school because of like the drought and all that stuff. And then your dad just told you to run back to the house, you're like, why? And then you just be off in the distance.
Yeah, it would be. It would be bad. You're absolutely right. That would not be an ideal way to have to try to live. Okay? So anyhow, the wheat did not anchor the soil or help hold the moisture in. So after years of abuse, the topsoil was destroyed and turned to dust. Okay? So with so much of the soil turned to dust, there was these huge dust storms in the Midwest. Because the wind starts blowing, because there's not that many trees. If you've ever been out in the Midwest, there's not a whole lot of trees. They're like anti-tree. The dust made it hard for people to breathe. It piled up to the point where houses were actually buried under the dust. We're not talking just a little dust blowing by. We're talking this stuff is so thick and there's so much of it and it's just constant that when it hits the house, it falls and it starts building up and it just buries a house. Okay, he would talk about how people would sleep with, they would try to cover themselves with something because they would wake up the next morning and it would be covered in dust where it would get into the house. Okay. So the dust made it hard for people to breathe. It piled up to the point where houses were buried. Some dust storms were so big that they carried dust all the way to the East Coast.
And they can't just like go stay with a relative or something. They're like in the middle of nowhere. They can't just go with someone. They can't go to proxy.
Yep. So giant dust storms were called black blizzards. Okay, because instead of a snow,
I've heard that.
it was just dark because it would actually get so thick that it would block the sun out.
I wonder what would be inside it.
It would be like the Spartan movie where they had like all of the arrows that blocked off the sun.
Yep, something like that.
Except it's just dust.
Yep. One of the worst dust storms occurred on Sunday, April 14th, 1935.
Why did it happen?
High-speed winds caused great walls of dust to engulf entire cities and regions. This dust storm was called Black Sunday.
Black Tuesday.
It was said that the dust was so thick that people could not see their own hands in front of their face if they were standing outside in it.
Crazy.
That's pretty thick. So, living in the Dust Bowl became nearly impossible. Dust got everywhere. The people spent much of their time trying to clean up the dust and keep it out of their homes. Okay? Many of the farmers had to move as they could not survive. Crops would not grow. Livestock was often choked to death by the dust. Okay, you couldn't leave them outside, but if you put them in the barn, the dust still got in. I mean, think about your house. Now, your homes are built a whole lot better than what these people's houses were. And yet, someone has to dust around your house every now and then, right? Because even with the windows and the doors and all the stuff that we have today, dust still manages to get in. And we don't live in a dust storm area. Okay? But your parents, someone has to dust because you will get dust in your home. Okay? So you can imagine when you got cracks and things like that. And I mean, when I was growing up, the home I grew up in, if the wind was blowing in the wintertime, the curtains would move inside because you did not have, there was no insulation. It didn't fit that well. So you can imagine in the summertime you got dust. In the wintertime you got wind. I mean, it was, you know, we had an old tin roof, and my brother and I slept upstairs, and we would lay upstairs and count the stars through the holes in the tin roof. But when it rained, if you could catch it all in the pots, it put you to sleep. The sound of rain on the tin roof, it put you right out. If you weren't swimming, trying to survive. Yeah.
Hey, Mom.
Hey, it was good times. I gotta tell you, I wouldn't trade that. I would not trade the way I grew up for anything. That was wonderful times. Many of the farmers and their families migrated to California, where they had heard there was jobs. Jobs are hard to come by, obviously during the Great Depression. They were desperate for any work, even if they had to work long hours, for just enough food to survive. Poor farmers who moved from the Dust Bowl to California were called Okies. Okay? The name was short for people from Oklahoma. Okay? But was used to reference any poor person from the Dust Bowl looking for work. Okay? The federal government implemented programs to help the farmers that stayed in the Dust Bowl. They taught farmers proper farming practices to help preserve the soil. They also purchased some land and let it regenerate in order to prevent future dust storms. Now, all this, of course, takes time. This is not an overnight fix. But much of the land had recovered by the early 1940s. Okay? Interesting facts about the Dust Bowl. The state of California enacted a law that made it illegal to bring people into the state. Bring poor people into the state, excuse me. Yeah, a little bit different now, isn't it? Kind of a 180. Arthur John Steinbeck wrote about a migrant family from the Dust Bowl in The Grapes of Wrath. You're probably going to read that when you get high school. About 60% of the population left the region during the Dust Bowl. Between 1934 and 1942, the federal government planted around 220 million trees from Canada down to Texas in order to create a windbreak to protect soil from wind evaporation and erosion. The drought ended in most regions when it started raining again in about 1939. And farmers would sometimes string clothesline between the houses and the barn so that they could actually find their way during the dust storm. If they had to get out to the barn, they actually strung wire from the house to the barn so that they could just hold on to it and walk because they couldn't see the barn.
Imagine it falling down.
Okay. Yeah, that would not have been good if that thing had broken. You was about halfway there, and you couldn't figure out which way to get back to the house or get to the barn. That would not have been a good opportunity there.
I would have followed
All right, bye.